Okay, everybody. Last video left off on slide number 11, picking up here on slide number 12. Not a whole lot to say here. It's a little self-explanatory. We can see that the solid line is the forces going through the pelvic girdle when we are standing. So no surprise that they are including the femur. And then the dashed line is the line of force going through the pelvic girdle as we are in a seated position. So no surprise, they are excluding the femur. Thus, we are literally taking the weight off. If we move on to slide 13, we say this is a ball and socket joint. This is the second most mobile joint, being the shoulder is the first. But the shoulder having such a huge range of motion, that comes at a cost. We've already discussed that earlier on in the semester, but just as a quick review, that cost is the more range of motion that we have, the less stability that joint possesses. Here at the hip, we can't move it near as much as what we can as our shoulder. As a result, we do gain some stability. So the hip is a much more stable joint compared to the shoulder, but we don't have quite as much range of motion. So here are our keys to stability. One, as we mentioned before, was the bone structure. The femoral head inserting into the acetabulum. So this is a nice deep ball and socket joint. The acetabulum literally holds the head of the femur into place, and that greatly increases our stability. For the joint capsule and the ligaments, these have a very distinct pattern that we'll talk more about here on the next slide that allow us to have really good stability throughout the full range of motion. So let's move on and we'll talk about that real quick. Here on slide 14, these are called iliofemoral or the Y ligament, pubofemoral ligament, and the ischiofemoral ligament. The names of these ligaments are not as important for my class. You might need to know them for future anatomy courses, but for my class, what I really want you to focus on is the orientation of these ligaments. Notice how they're in a crisscross pattern. This crisscross pattern is essential for our overall stability. So think back, has everybody seen those finger traps that are typically a really light material and they're woven in crisscross pattern? You put your right finger in one side, your left finger in the other, and as you pull it apart, it becomes tighter, tighter, tighter. Keep that in the back of your mind and now place that thought into the ligament structure of the hip. Given that these are in a crisscross pattern, as we take a step forward, with our femur going out in front of us, it's pulling on that joint. And because it's a crisscross pattern, it's actually tightening the joint. So as a result, we are pretty well protected throughout a full range of motion by the ligaments here at the hip. This is drastically different than what we saw at the shoulder. The shoulder, we are pretty vulnerable at rest and have some protection towards our endpoint range of motion. But here, because of this crisscross pattern of the ligaments, this allows us to have a really good stability throughout our entire range of motion. So that's very unique to the hip. We don't see that in other regions of the body. Moving on to slide 15, where the femoral head fits into the acetabulum, it's kind of anchored in the base here. That anchor is called a teres ligament. So it attaches from deep within the acetabulum to a depression within the femoral head. So this also greatly stabilizes the joint. We say it slightly limits adduction, but from an anatomical standpoint, the increase in stability is quite beneficial when you consider it only slightly limits our range of motion. So I want to show you this quick image here on slide 16. And we say when an individual goes into hip flexion, as you see here with the cursor, this is hip flexion, we can go about 120 degrees. And then if you were lying in the prone position and you go into hip extension, you can't go very far. It's only about 30 degrees or less. And if you ever had to do this for goniometry measurements, this is actually quite uncomfortable to even hold it at 30 degrees. So the question is, why the huge difference? Why do we have so much more range of motion going into flexion than we do into extension? And the answer is very well demonstrated here visually in image A and B. If you look at these images, notice how the acetabulum on the right and left pelvic girdle, this is really on the anterior side. So with these facing anteriorly, we have a much bigger range of motion anteriorly, which is where flexion comes in. So you can see that if an individual wants to put their hip back posteriorly into extension, you're really going against the grain for where this ball and socket joint is set up. So we just can't move as far behind us as we do in front of us. If we just take a little bit of common sense for the rest of our body, I've always thought of this as no surprise. Your eyes are on the front of our face. Your ears are cupped forward to keep us looking forward and listening to things in front of us. It's been no surprise to me that your acetabulum is also facing forward. Keep in mind, we also mentioned this at the level of the shoulder. The glenoid fossa is cupped forward, and just as we see here at the hip, at the shoulder, we don't have nearly the range of motion into extension as what we see into flexion. So that's why we see a really big difference here. It's the bone structure setting us up for that. For AB adduction, very little difference here between abduction and adduction. For internal external rotation, once again, very little difference between those two ranges of motion. Now our next topic is a very large topic here, starting on slide number 19. So as a result, I'm going to stop here at slide 18 and we'll make its own video for this next topic starting on slide 19.